My daughter-in-law never eats the food I cook, nor does she ever want to stand near me. She says I smell like garbage. Worse yet, she forbids my grandchildren from visiting me, throws my homemade apple pies out into the yard, and scrubs the floor clean every time I come over. I'm treated like someone carrying a contagious disease, isolated, unwanted. But when they need money the most, they still come knocking on my door, speaking in that same ungrateful tone. If you want to know why my own children turned out this cruel, stay with me until the very end of this video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, my dear viewers. I promise my story will not disappoint you. When I look back on my life, I often think about the smell of disinfectant and fresh linen, the scent of the hospital corridors where I spent more than 30 years of my life. I was the head of the cleaning department at St. Vincent Medical Center. Some people might think that's a humble job, but to me, it was an honorable one. Every floor I mopped, every window I polished, was a small promise I kept to do things right, even when no one was watching. Nurses, doctors, even the patients, they all trusted me. That trust was my pride. It was the reason I never missed a single day of work unless I was truly sick. Now, at 68, I live quietly, retired but far from helpless. My pension comes in every month, steady as the ticking of the clock above my kitchen counter. Over the years, I learned how to save, how to invest a little here and there. I never told my son, Johnson, or his wife about that. Some things a woman keeps to herself, especially when she's worked this hard to earn them. Between my savings and my investments, I have about $500,000 tucked away. A cushion that lets me live on my own terms, not anyone else's. My late husband, Harold, used to tease me, calling me his little accountant. He was a plumber, a man with rough hands and a gentle heart. We built a simple life together, no luxury, but plenty of laughter. Our dream was small but pure, to grow old side by side, tending a garden, maybe traveling once a year to see the ocean. But life had other plans. When Harold was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, everything I had saved suddenly had one purpose: to give him comfort, to buy him time. I spent nearly every penny, and I never once regretted it. I still remember sitting by his hospital bed, holding his hand while the machines hummed softly. His eyes were tired but peaceful. He told me, "You've done enough, Lynn. Promise me you'll keep living proud." After he passed, the house felt unbearably quiet. I learned to make peace with solitude. I tended to my little backyard, brewed my morning coffee, and reminded myself that independence isn't loneliness, it's dignity. I don't need anyone to take care of me. I just need to live with the same honesty and strength that have guided me all these years. Johnson always said he was busy. Meetings, clients, investors, there was always something. After his father passed, those excuses became more frequent, and the space between us stretched farther than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was just work, that success demanded time. But deep down, I knew the truth. My son was ashamed. He didn't want his new world to be reminded of where he came from, or of a mother who used to scrub hospital floors for a living. He lived in Cleveland Heights, a quiet and polished neighborhood with large lawns and manicured hedges. His wife, Susan, loved showing off their glass-walled kitchen and designer furniture. She was all charm on the surface, her voice sweet, her smile tight, but every visit felt like walking through invisible glass. The air around her carried a silent warning: don't touch too much, don't stay too long. Once I reached out to hold my grandson's hand, and she instinctively pulled out a wet wipe, cleaning his fingers right after. "Kids pick up germs so easily," she said lightly, though her eyes told a different story. Another time, I noticed her spraying air freshener right after I left the guest room, a gesture so casual it hurt more than open insult. And when she laughed and said, "Oh, you still have that old uniform, how cute," I only smiled. I had no answer that wouldn't make things worse. At dinner parties, they told people about me, not as family, but as a story to entertain. "My mother worked at St. Vincent Hospital for 30 years, Susan would say, sipping her wine. "She kept the place spotless. That's probably where Johnson got his discipline." Guests would nod, laugh politely, and move on to safer topics like stocks and vacations. They thought it was endearing. They didn't hear the edge in her tone. I didn't confront them. I just stopped wearing the uniform when I visited. I'd sit quietly in their living room, admiring the art on the walls and pretending I belonged in that world of polished marble and quiet judgment. I told myself that love doesn't need to be loud, that mothers forgive. But sometimes, when I rode the bus home at night, I looked out at the glowing houses along the street and felt the weight of a truth I never wanted to face. The line between love and shame can be as thin as class dot. The house I live in isn't grand or new, but it holds every chapter of my life. Harold and I bought it more than 30 years ago, back when the mortgage papers seemed heavier than bricks. It's a two-story wooden house with peeling white paint and a porch that creaks when the wind blows. Most of my neighbors have moved away or passed on, but I've stayed. This place is the last piece of us. Every morning begins the same. I boil water for tea, tune the old radio to the morning news, and feed Daisy, my little terrier who's been my companion for the past 7 years. She follows me from room to room, her nails clicking softly on the wooden floor. After breakfast, I sit by the window where the light falls just right on Harold's photograph. I tell him about the weather, about Daisy's new tricks, about how quiet the house feels. Some people might think it's strange, but for me, it's comforting. Talking to him makes me feel he's still nearby, just on the other side of the silence. The house is full of memories. The wedding photo above the fireplace, the porcelain tea set Harold gave me on our 15th anniversary, the worn-out recipe books I still use. Each item carries a story, a piece of laughter, or a trace of our old struggles. In the corner of the bookshelf sits a small fireproof box. Inside are the documents that define the life I've built: the house deed, insurance papers, bank records, and an old will that still lists Johnson as my sole heir. Sometimes, when I take out that will, my hands tremble a little. I read Harold's old signature beside mine and feel a twist in my chest. We had written it when we still believed our son would carry our values forward, not turn away from them. I've thought about changing it many times, especially since the distance between us has grown. But each time I stop myself. No matter what, he's still my son. Blood isn't something you erase with a pen. Yet lately, there's a whisper in my mind that won't quiet down, a quiet unease that something isn't right. Maybe it's the way Susan talks about family assets, or the way Johnson avoids eye contact when I mention the house. Or maybe it's just the loneliness playing tricks on me. Still, when I lock the box and return it to the shelf, I feel a strange weight pressing on my heart, as if the walls themselves are warning me to stay alert. Holidays used to mean warmth, laughter, and the smell of Harold's roast turkey filling the house. Now they come with a quiet tension that settles in my chest days before Susan's call arrives. Her voice on the phone is always polite, but cold enough to frost glass. "Are you planning to come over, Linda? If so, let me know ahead so I can prepare," she says every year. It sounds less like an invitation and more like a warning label. Still, I always say yes. Not because I feel welcome, but because a mother should never be the one to give up first. When I arrive, Susan greets me with a quick smile that never reaches her eyes. She's usually adjusting her dress, answering messages, or giving orders to the caterers. "Make yourself comfortable," she says, already walking away. The house is beautiful. Too beautiful, really. Shiny marble floors, silver ornaments, and the faint smell of expensive candles. But beneath all that polish, I can feel the distance. Johnson hovers nearby, saying little. He laughs when I make a comment, but it's a nervous, half-hearted sound. I can tell he's afraid of choosing sides. I bring small gifts each time, simple things from my heart: a box of homemade apple tarts, a knitted scarf I made while watching TV. Susan always thanks me, but sets them aside like decorations she doesn't plan to use. Once, I caught her whispering to a guest, "She's sweet, but she still brings those little country things." The guest nodded, smiling politely. My cheeks burned, but I pretended not to hear. During one Thanksgiving, I sat in the backyard chatting with a neighbor about the rising cost of electricity. It was a harmless conversation, Something older folks talk about. Susan walked by and said with a sweet smile, "Oh, don't worry, Linda. We pay our own utility bills here." Everyone chuckled, but I heard the quiet blade hidden beneath her words. What she really meant was that I came from a different world, one that didn't belong at their table. That night, I rode home with the box of tarts untouched beside me. Daisy greeted me at the door, tail wagging, her joy unspoiled by pride or pretense. I sat down, unwrapped the scarf I had made for Susan, and folded it neatly back into the drawer. Some gifts, I realized, are not meant to be received. They're just reminders, to give without expecting, to love without needing to be loved back. Ethan and Liam are the only reason my weekends still feel alive. Ethan is 12, quiet and thoughtful like his grandfather, and Liam, 9, is all sunshine and energy. They remind me of what love looks like before pride and money twist it into something else. Every Saturday, they tell their parents they're going to a study group, then pedal their bikes across town to my house. I always hear the sound of their laughter before I see them, like little bells breaking through the silence of my empty street. They burst through the gate, drop their bikes on the grass, and run straight to Daisy, who dances around them in circles. "Grandma, can we make apple pie again?" Liam always asks before even taking off his shoes. Ethan rolls his eyes but smiles. "Only if she lets you measure the sugar this time," he teases. I laugh and tie aprons around their small waists, my hands trembling just slightly, not from age but from joy. We peel apples together at the kitchen table. The sunlight filters through the lace curtains, painting golden shapes across the counter. I show them how to mix butter into flour, how to pinch the edges of the crust just right. They listen carefully, even when they get flour on their noses. "Grandma, how do you remember all this without a recipe?" Ethan asks. I smile. Because some things are learned with the heart, not the eyes. When the pie goes into the oven, the house fills with the scent of cinnamon and baked apples. While we wait, I tell them stories. How I met their grandfather. How we saved every penny for this house. How love was simpler when people looked at each other instead of their phones. They listen wide-eyed, as if I were telling them a secret from another world. Before they leave, I hand Ethan the handwritten recipe, edges smudged with flour. In the corner, I scribble softly with a pencil, "Love, Grandma." He folds it carefully as if it were treasure. Those afternoons feel like a secret the world can't ruin. In their laughter, I find warmth that no cold word from Susan can erase. They don't know about the tension between their parents and me, and I want to keep it that way. But deep inside, I know the day will come when truth can no longer stay buried. When that day arrives, I want them to remember me not as someone broken by betrayal, but as a woman who stood tall, who loved them enough to protect her dignity, no matter the cost. The rain came down in sheets that night, drumming against the roof like an angry heartbeat. The power flickered twice before settling into a dim, uneasy glow. I remember thinking I should shower quickly before the lights went out again. The bathroom tiles were cold under my feet, the air thick with steam. I turned to grab the towel, and that's when my heel slipped. The sound of the fall was sharp and final. My left arm hit the edge of the tub with a crack that sent a white-hot pain shooting up to my shoulder. My head struck the wall, and the world blurred into a gray fog. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I was breathing. All I could hear was the water running, mixing with the rain outside, a lonely duet of sound. Then came Daisy's barking, fierce, desperate, almost human. She scratched the door with her tiny paws, crying and growling all at once. "It's okay, baby," I tried to say, but the words came out broken, swallowed by the pain. I felt myself drifting, half awake, half fading. Time lost all meaning. I don't know how long it took before I heard another sound. The faint echo of footsteps and a woman's voice calling my name. It was Alice, my neighbor. She must have heard Daisy's frantic cries through the storm. "Linda, are you in there?" she shouted, and before I could answer, the door splintered. She rushed in, soaked and terrified, her eyes wide when she saw me on the floor. "Oh my God, stay still," she gasped, fumbling for her phone. Within minutes, the wail of sirens cut through the rain. 2 paramedics appeared, their uniforms dripping, their movements quick and practiced. I felt their hands lift me onto a stretcher. the straps cold against my skin. The pain in my arm throbbed like fire, but what hurt most was the silence inside me, the hollow knowledge that no one in my family knew or maybe cared that I had fallen. When the nurse asked if she should call my son, I forced a smile that wasn't really there. "Don't call Johnson," I murmured. "He's busy." The words slipped out softly, but I saw the nurse pause, her eyes filled with quiet pity. As the ambulance doors closed, the rain kept pouring. The siren wailed, but inside the vehicle, there was only the sound of my own heartbeat, steady but faint, a reminder that even strength has its breaking point. The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and wilted flowers. My arm was wrapped in a thick white cast, suspended by a strap, and a dull ache pulsed from my shoulder down to my wrist. The doctor had explained it clearly that morning: fractured forearm, mild concussion, 7 days of rest and observation. 7 days in a sterile room, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and strangers' footsteps echoing through the hall. On the second day, Johnson and Susan arrived. They looked more like they were attending a meeting than visiting a mother in the hospital. Johnson's tie was still perfectly knotted. His phone never left his hand. Susan wore a beige blazer and heels, the click of her shoes breaking the silence as she entered. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give when someone's watching, not when you care. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Johnson asked, eyes darting to his watch before meeting mine. I could hear the impatience in his tone, that slight tap of his foot betraying the thought he wouldn't say out loud. "How long will this take?" Susan folded her arms. "You really shouldn't live alone anymore," she said, voice soft but sharp at the edges. "If you fall again, who's responsible? That old house of yours, it's not exactly safe for someone your age." Her words floated in the air, polished and polite, but cold as the hospital tiles. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides more than it reveals. "I've managed just fine," I said. "I'm used to taking care of myself." Susan gave a small nod, as if to end the topic. Johnson cleared his throat, muttered something about checking emails, and stepped outside to take a call. The door clicked shut, leaving only the sound of the heart monitor beeping steadily. The doctor, who had been quietly reviewing my chart by the window, turned slightly. He didn't say a word, but his pen paused before moving across the paper. I caught a glimpse of his notes. "Patient lives alone. No family support at home." For a moment, embarrassment burned in my chest, but then I realized it wasn't shame. It was truth. When they finally left, Susan's perfume lingered longer than her concern. I looked out the window, watching the rain slide down the glass, and whispered to myself, "I'm still here." The beeping machine answered like a heartbeat, steady and alive. Johnson's voice cut through the quiet room like a sharp blade. "Maybe you should just move in with us," he said, tone clipped, more command than suggestion. "We have a spare room and a private nurse. It'd be safer. Besides, you won't have to bother the neighbors anymore." The words hung heavy in the air. On the surface, they sounded caring, but I knew better. I had spent my life reading between the lines, learning how false kindness often wears a polite smile. His concern wasn't love, it was control. Moving into their house would mean giving up the last piece of freedom I had left, the right to live on my own terms, under my own roof. I kept my face calm, even as my chest tightened. "That's kind of you," I said softly, "but I'm fine where I am." Before I could say more, Susan spoke up. Her voice was smooth, sweet, rehearsed. "Don't worry, Linda. We'll have our lawyer draft a consent form, just a simple paper, to make sure if anything happens, we're not held legally responsible. You understand, right?" I looked at her, and for a brief moment our eyes locked. Hers were cool and calculating, a hint of impatience behind the polite expression. That's when it became clear. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid of me. Afraid of being blamed, afraid of obligation, afraid that their image of the perfect, successful couple might crack under the weight of an aging mother. My fingers traced the edge of my hospital blanket. I smiled faintly, hiding the storm inside me. "Of course," I said. "I wouldn't want to trouble you." Johnson nodded quickly, relieved as if the problem had been solved. "Good," he said, pulling out his phone. Susan will handle the paperwork. Paperwork. That word echoed in my mind long after they left. They thought of everything in terms of contracts, clauses, and control, but they had forgotten something. I spent decades keeping records, managing hospital files, tracking details others ignored. If they wanted to play with documents, they had no idea who they were up against. That night, when the nurse turned off the light, I stared at the ceiling and let the thought settle deep inside me. If they trust papers more than people, then I'll use papers to teach them what trust really costs. The sadness faded, replaced by something colder, sharper, a quiet resolve that would soon take shape. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm used to living alone." Johnson's expression hardened. His jaw tightened the way it always did when he thought someone was defying him. "You're impossible, Mom," he snapped. "Always so stubborn. Do you think you're the only one who's tired? We have jobs, kids, responsibilities. You can't just expect us to drop everything every time something happens." I wanted to tell him I never asked for anything, not once. But the words caught in my throat. The space between us had grown too wide for truth to cross. Susan sighed dramatically, tugging at his sleeve. "Let it go," she said, her tone smooth but cutting. "If she wants to stay here alone, let her. Maybe she just enjoys being pitied." Her words landed like a blade, sharp, deliberate, cruel. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The silence was the only dignity I had left. Johnson looked away, ashamed but unwilling to defend me. They gathered their things quickly, his phone, her purse, their pride, and walked toward the door. The moment the door closed, the room fell into a hollow quiet. Only the rain outside filled the emptiness, tapping softly against the window pane. I turned my head slowly, watching the droplets slide down the glass, merging, separating, falling again, like the years of love that had slipped between us without notice. For a long time I sat there listening to the rain. My arm throbbed beneath the cast, but the ache inside my chest was worse. It wasn't just disappointment, it was realization. Something fragile inside me, something that still believed they might come back to the warmth of love, cracked and disappeared. By the time the nurse came in to check my vitals, I had already dried my eyes. "You're a strong woman, Mrs. Hale," she said kindly. I smiled faintly. Strength, I thought, is just what's left when love is gone. From that night on, the world felt quieter. I no longer waited for the sound of their footsteps in the hallway. Instead, I watched the rain until the window blurred completely, and I made a silent promise to myself. Never again would I beg for affection disguised as duty. The days that followed were quieter, softer somehow. The pain in my arm dulled with time, replaced by the gentle rhythm of care from people who didn't share my blood, but shared something far more genuine. Every morning, Alice, my neighbor, appeared at the hospital door with a thermos of chicken soup and a small stack of magazines. "Homemade," she would say with a wink, placing the warm container on my tray. Her kindness was simple, unspoken, and real. By afternoon, two of my old friends from the hospital's cleaning staff came by, Marjorie and Ruth. We used to scrub the same hallways together years ago, laughing through long night shifts. Now they came one after another, carrying flowers from their gardens, fussing over my pillows, and joking that I looked far too elegant for a patient. Their presence filled the room with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. It reminded me that love doesn't always come from family. It comes from those who show up when no one else will. At the doctor's suggestion, I hired a private nurse to help once I was discharged. Her name was Helen, the same nurse who had cared for Harold during his final months. When she entered the room, her familiar face brought an unexpected comfort. She was steady, professional, never overstepping, but always present when I needed her most. She managed my medication, helped me dress, and talked to me about small things, the weather, her garden, the latest hospital gossip. Yet beneath her calm tone, I could sense her quiet understanding. She didn't pity me. She respected me. During my recovery, I began writing everything down, every visit, every word, every receipt. I logged the dates my son didn't call, the meals Alice brought, the nurses' invoices I paid myself. Each detail went into a small blue notebook that I kept tucked beside my bed. Just in case, I told myself. I didn't yet know what I would need to prove, but instinct told me that truth, when written, could one day become justice. On the last night before my discharge, the room was calm. The machines hummed softly, the rain had stopped, and the moonlight spread across the sheets. Helen came in to check my bandages, then sat quietly by the window. "You know," she said gently, "sometimes the worst things that happen to us are really gifts in disguise. They show us who truly cares." I looked at her, my lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "I think I'm starting to understand that," I said. And for the first time in a long while, the ache in my chest began to ease. 2 months after I was discharged, peace had finally settled back into my days. The lavender in my garden was in bloom again. Daisy spent her afternoons dozing under the porch, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of memory pressing on my chest. That morning I was pouring hot tea when I heard pounding on the door. Urgent, uneven, almost frantic. When I opened it, Johnson stood there, drenched from the rain. His once immaculate shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, his face pale and drawn. The confident son I remembered, the one who used to talk about market returns and expansion deals, was gone. In his place stood a man unraveling. "Mom," he started, voice cracking. "I didn't know where else to go." He ran a shaky hand through his hair, avoiding my eyes. "The company's in serious trouble. We're under federal investigation for financial misconduct. My accounts, everything, have been frozen. I can't even access the business line of credit." He looked smaller somehow, cornered by consequences he couldn't charm his way out of. "I just need a short-term loan," he said, almost whispering. 200,000, that's all. Just until things settle. I swear I'll pay it back in a few weeks." The number hit me like a gust of cold wind. $200,000, almost half of what Harold and I had spent a lifetime saving. I stared at him, searching for the son who once brought me wildflowers from the yard, the boy who promised he'd take care of me when I was old. But all I saw now was desperation, tinged with guilt. 200,000, I repeated slowly. "That's a lot of money, Johnson." He forced a nervous laugh. "It's just temporary, Mom. You know I'd never ask if it wasn't serious. I can't let Susan find out yet. She'd panic. You've always been good with savings. Please, help me this one time." He reached for my hand, the same hand he once refused to let near his dinner guests for fear they'd smell cleaning detergent. Now he held it as if his life depended on it. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back either. Inside, something in me hardened. Not from anger, but from clarity. I had waited years for an apology, a sign of humility, and here it was, disguised as a plea for money. The irony wasn't lost on me. I poured him a cup of tea, my movements calm and deliberate. "You must be cold," I said softly. He nodded, too shaken to notice the distance in my tone. As the rain tapped against the window, I watched him, the steam curling between us like a veil. For the first time in years, the balance had shifted. The son who once pitied me now stood on the edge of his own downfall, and I, the mother he underestimated, finally held the power to decide his fate. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky was still gray, heavy with leftover clouds. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the small safe hidden behind the bookshelf. Inside was the quiet weight of 30 years of work, my pension, my savings, the careful investments Harold and I made for our old age. I hadn't opened it since his death. When I finally turned the dial and pulled the handle, the faint click sounded like a sigh. Neatly folded bills, old documents, and a checkbook lay inside, untouched and organized. I picked up the checkbook, running my fingers over the cover. The sum he had asked for, $200,000, echoed in my mind like a drumbeat. For a moment I hesitated. Harold's voice seemed to rise from the stillness of the room, gentle yet firm. "Don't let anyone take advantage of you, Lynn. You've earned every dollar." His words had guided me through decades of struggle. But this was my son, my only child. The one I had raised alone after Harold passed. The one I still believed had good inside him. buried somewhere beneath the ambition and pride. I sat there a while longer, pen in hand, heart caught between memory and love. Then I wrote the number, 200,000, and signed my name beneath it. My signature looked steadier than I felt. When Johnson came back that evening, he stood in the doorway, restless, tapping his foot against the wooden floor. I handed him the check without a word at first. His hands were cold when they brushed against mine. "Mom," he murmured. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds both pride and pain. "I'm not a rich woman," I said softly, "but I want you to stand again. Use this wisely." He looked down at the check. For a brief second I searched his face, hoping to see gratitude, some spark of warmth, of humility, but there was none. Only relief, and something harder to name, something like calculation. "Thank you," he said quickly, folding the check into his jacket pocket. He didn't meet my eyes. Within moments, he was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne and the sound of Daisy's quiet whimper from under the table. I sat back down, staring at the teacup still warm on the counter. Part of me wanted to believe he'd come back, not just for help, but for forgiveness. Yet deep inside, I felt a quiet unease, an old, familiar tug that told me love can blind even the strongest hearts. I didn't hand over the check right away. After all the years I'd spent working in hospitals, I'd learned one thing: paper protects truth better than words ever can. So before Johnson could leave with the money, I told him calmly, "If this is a loan, we'll write it down properly, for both our sakes." He frowned, clearly irritated. "Mom, do you really need to make this official? It's just between us." I looked at him steadily. "Exactly. Because it's between us, it should be done right." That afternoon, I called Alice and Helen to come over. Alice arrived first, still wearing her gardening hat, and Helen followed soon after with her clipboard in hand. Both women had seen me through sickness and recovery. They knew the value of documentation and fairness. We sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Harold and I once planned our entire future. On a clean sheet of paper, I wrote slowly and clearly: loan agreement, $200,000 USD, term 12 months, interest 0%. Borrower, Johnson Hale, lender, Linda Hale. Johnson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable. I slid the paper across to him along with a pen. "It's simple," I said. "Just write your name." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mom, you're acting like we're doing a real estate deal." I smiled faintly. "Because I want everything to be clear, so no one feels guilty later." The notary at the local office stamped the document with a heavy thud, the ink still damp when I folded it neatly into a folder. We made 3 copies, one for me, one for him, and one sealed in a small envelope for record. Alice and Helen signed as witnesses, their names looping confidently at the bottom of the page. Johnson pocketed his copy, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You really don't trust me, do you?" he said lightly, though the bitterness was plain in his tone. I met his gaze, calm and steady. "I trust the paper, it never forgets." As he walked out, the sound of the door closing felt heavier than usual. I slipped my copy into the safe, the same place where I'd once kept my wedding ring and Harold's letters. But this time, the paper wasn't a symbol of love. It was protection. For the first time in months, I felt strangely at peace. Maybe I couldn't change who my son had become, but I could make sure the truth stayed on record. When Susan found out about the loan, she didn't bother calling first. The next morning, her silver car pulled up in front of my house, tires crunching on the gravel. She stepped out, heels clicking sharply against the walkway, her face as cold as the wind that followed her in. She didn't sit down. She didn't even take off her coat. "So," she said flatly, crossing her arms, "I hear you made Johnson sign a debt agreement. $200,000. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned. "We'll pay it back, of course, but it's strange, isn't it, that a mother would need a piece of paper to trust her own son?" Her tone carried no curiosity, only accusation. I stayed quiet, watching the way her polished nails tapped against her sleeve. She wanted a fight. I gave her silence instead. Susan took a step closer, her perfume sharp, her words sharper. "What's the paper for, Linda? You plan to wave it around later, threaten us with it? You're acting like some kind of bank. We don't need your charity. I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had treated me like an inconvenience for years, who measured worth in property deeds and luxury handbags. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice was calm when I answered. I don't give charity, I said softly. I help within the law. For the first time, Susan didn't know what to say. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The arrogance drained from her face, replaced by something that almost looked like disbelief. She turned to glance at Johnson, who stood awkwardly behind her, eyes down, pretending to check his phone. I could see it in her, the fury of someone who realized she had lost control. She wanted me to stay small, quiet, guilty for existing. But I wasn't that woman anymore. After a few tense seconds, she muttered something about ungrateful old habits and marched toward the door. Johnson followed, not meeting my eyes. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a final gavel strike. I stood still for a moment, then reached for the doorknob and turned the lock. My hand shook, not from fear, but from the surge of something new. Clarity, strength, a strange calm that came from choosing myself over their approval. The house was silent again. Daisy lay at my feet, her small head resting on my slippers. I exhaled slowly, realizing that for the first time in years, my voice had not trembled. Power, I finally understood, was not about shouting or winning. It was about staying steady when others tried to make you doubt yourself. I still remembered the boys' birthdays, no matter how complicated things had become with their parents. That week, I sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon light spilling through the lace curtains, and wrote 2 cards in my neat, looping handwriting. One for Ethan, one for Liam. Inside, I slipped small bookstore gift cards and a note written from the heart. Love doesn't need conditions, but respect is always a choice. I sealed the envelopes carefully and took them to the post office myself. It was my quiet way of reminding them that family isn't about money, it's about the way we treat each other when no one is watching. A week later, I received a very different kind of message. Alice came by, her arms full of groceries, and as she unpacked them on my counter, she hesitated. Linda, she said softly, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I heard Johnson sold his car last week, and Susan pawned that diamond ring she always wears. She glanced at me carefully, as if weighing whether to continue. But I also saw them dining downtown last night, at that new French restaurant. Champagne on the table, too. I stirred my tea slowly, watching the ripples fade. If they can still afford champagne, I said with a faint smile, then they're doing just fine. Alice sighed, shaking her head. You're too forgiving. Maybe I was. Or maybe forgiveness was just easier than admitting disappointment. I didn't need to see the bank records to know the truth. If they were pawning jewelry and selling cars but hadn't mentioned the debt, then the money I'd given had already vanished into the same hole that swallowed their integrity. That night, I sat in my armchair, reading through old letters Harold had written me decades ago. In one of them, his words seemed to echo the lesson I was only now learning. Trust is a gift, but once broken, it should never be handed back too quickly. I closed the letter and looked at the stack of documents on the coffee table, the loan agreement, the copies, the notary seal. I had wanted to believe that paper could bind honesty as strongly as love once did. But as I watched the rain blur the window again, I realized something else. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive like a storm. Sometimes it slips quietly through the door, smiling, asking for a favor. A week after I had fully recovered, the house finally smelled like home again. Lavender from the windowsill, cinnamon from the oven. That morning was special. It was Ethan's 12th birthday. I woke before dawn, tied my apron, and began to make the apple pie he loved so much. The scent of butter, sugar, and spice filled the kitchen, soft and comforting, like a memory that refused to fade. Daisy sat at my feet, tail wagging, as if she too remembered the last time the boys were here, their laughter echoing through these old walls. I sifted the flour carefully, thinking about each detail. The crust had to be golden but tender, the apples thin and even. I hummed a tune Harold used to whistle while fixing the fence, something quiet and steady. This pie wasn't just dessert, it was a message, a bridge, a small act of love I hoped would still reach my grandchildren no matter how much distance their parents had tried to build. While the pie baked, I wrapped two small gifts. The first was a worn copy of The Call of the Wild, a story about courage and survival. I thought Ethan might see a bit of himself in it, that spark of adventure still untouched by the world's cruelty. The second was a pair of wool gloves I'd knitted through the cold winter nights, each stitch steady and patient. I tied both with simple twine and tucked a handwritten note inside. For the hands that will one day build their own world. Love, Grandma. As I packed everything neatly into a basket, my heart felt both heavy and hopeful. I imagined the boys' faces lighting up when they saw me at the door, the smell of the pie filling their kitchen. Maybe, I thought, this day could soften what had hardened between us. Maybe family could still mean something. But beneath that quiet hope, something else had begun to stir, a whisper I could no longer ignore. I had noticed too many small signs lately: missing bank notices, calls Johnson avoided, the nervous way Susan's smile twitched when money was mentioned. Trust had cracks in it now, fine but deep, and though I carried love in one hand, in the other I carried caution. Before leaving, I placed a second basket on the counter, this one filled with documents, receipts, and the signed loan agreement. I had already begun contacting an old acquaintance, a retired accountant who sometimes worked with local attorneys. Just in case, I told myself. I wanted to believe I was overthinking, but instinct rarely lies. As the clock struck 9, I took off my apron, adjusted my shawl, and looked once more at the pie cooling on the counter. It was perfect, golden, fragrant, glowing softly in the morning light. For my grandchildren, it was a gift of love. For their parents, though they didn't yet know it, it would soon become the first act in something much larger. When I reached my son's house, I stopped at the gate and stood there for a long moment. The villa looked dazzling under the midday sun, trimmed hedges perfectly shaped, cars lined neatly in the driveway. From the backyard came bursts of laughter, music, and the faint clinking of champagne glasses. For a brief second, I almost turned back. But then I saw the colorful balloons tied to the fence, the kind Ethan always loved, and I took a deep breath. As I was about to open the gate, a familiar voice drifted through the air, sharp and clear. "Susan. Only invite my side of the family," she said, her tone light but dripping with arrogance. "We don't need anyone here who'll embarrass us." The words hit me like a cold gust of wind. For a heartbeat, I froze, one hand resting on the iron gate. Embarrass them. That was who I was to her, a stain on her perfect picture, a reminder that wealth and manners can't rewrite where you come from. Still, I smiled, a small, steady smile that no longer came from weakness, but from something deeper, control. I had promised myself that nothing they said or did could ruin this day. It wasn't about Susan or Johnson anymore. It was about Ethan, about the boy who once held my hand while we baked pies, whose laughter had once filled my kitchen like sunlight. I adjusted the basket in my arms, feeling the warmth of the pie still seeping through the cloth. Inside it were the gifts, the gloves, and a birthday card sealed with care. My fingers trembled slightly, not from anger, but from a strange, calm determination. When the gate finally creaked open, Daisy barked softly from behind me, as if urging me on. The smell of grilled steak and wine drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of fresh-cut grass. I could see guests mingling around the pool, champagne glasses raised, smiles polished but empty. None of them looked toward the entrance. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my coat, and stepped inside. Each step felt deliberate, quiet, but firm. I could still hear Susan's laughter from the patio, bright and hollow. "Don't let anyone ruin the mood," she said to someone nearby, unaware that I was already there. I kept walking until I could see Ethan and Liam playing near the swing set. Their laughter, pure and unguarded, cut through the shallow noise of the party like sunlight breaking through clouds, and in that instant, all the noise faded. My purpose was simple: to see my grandchildren smile. The moment I stepped into the backyard, the noise seemed to dim for a heartbeat. Heads turned briefly, curious but polite, the way people look at a stranger who doesn't quite belong. I clutched the basket a little tighter, the warmth of the apple pie still radiating through the cloth. I had rehearsed this moment all morning. A simple smile, a quiet greeting, a hug for my grandchildren. But before I could even take another step, Susan appeared in front of me. She crossed her arms, blocking my way with the precision of someone defending her territory. Her eyes darted from my shoes to the basket in my hands. Then, with a thin smile that never reached her eyes, she spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You brought that," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "That smell. It's exactly like bleach. Do you even realize you're ruining the atmosphere?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen. My hands trembled slightly, but I held the basket closer to my chest. "I just wanted to give my grandson a little gift," I said softly, keeping my voice steady. Susan laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the music. "Keep it," she snapped. "You're not touching my children." Her words hung in the air like smoke, harsh and choking. The laughter from the other side of the pool faltered. Even the band seemed unsure whether to keep playing. For a second, all I could hear was the faint rustle of the party decorations swaying in the wind. I glanced toward the swing set. Ethan and Liam had stopped playing. Ethan's small face turned toward me, confusion clouding his smile. That alone almost broke me. I took a slow breath, trying to steady the pounding in my chest. "It's just a pie," I whispered. "For his birthday." Susan's lips curled. "You don't listen, do you?" I said no. Her voice rose, sharp as glass. "You don't belong here, Linda. Not in this house, not in this family. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was heavier than her words. I stood still, the pie trembling slightly in my hands. The smell of cinnamon and apples, once warm and comforting, now felt strangely bitter. Around us, no one moved. Even Johnson stood frozen by the patio, his expression blank, caught between pride and shame. For a long second, I thought about defending myself, about saying all the things I had swallowed for years. But then I caught sight of Ethan again, his eyes wide, his small hand clutching his brother's. That was enough. I turned my gaze back to Susan, met her stare, and said quietly, "Then I'll go." The party noise slowly resumed as I stepped back toward the gate. My hands were still shaking, but not from fear anymore. There's a strange power in silence, especially when it's the only dignity you have left. The laughter around us didn't stop. It only shifted, turned uneasy, edged with whispers. Before I could react, Susan's perfectly manicured hand shot out. With a flick of her wrist, she struck the basket from my grasp. The pie box fell, spinning once before crashing onto the polished tile. It burst open with a dull, wet sound, apples, cinnamon, and crumbs scattering across the immaculate floor. The smell that once filled my kitchen with warmth now mixed with humiliation. I froze. The chatter dimmed, and then came the quiet gasp of guests pretending not to see. The bright balloons, the music, the glittering decorations, all of it blurred. All I could focus on was the ruined pie at my feet, the pieces glistening in syrup like a memory crushed under someone's heel. Behind Susan's shoulder, I saw them, Ethan and little Liam. They had been playing near the swing set, but now they stood still, their faces pale, their eyes wide and wet. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ethan's voice broke through the silence, sharp with heartbreak. "Mom! Grandma made that for me!" he shouted, his small fists clenched. His voice cracked, but it carried across the yard, cutting through the shallow music. Susan didn't even flinch. She bent slightly, her tone calm, almost rehearsed. "No, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "That's dirty." The words hung in the air, cruel and deliberate. Liam started crying first, then Ethan followed, his sobs raw and helpless. Their tiny bodies shook as Susan pulled them both away, her polished heels clicking sharply on the stone patio. She didn't look back. I knelt down slowly, my knees pressing against the cold tile. Around me, people pretended to talk, to sip their drinks, but I could feel their eyes watching, curious, uncomfortable, relieved it wasn't them. I reached out to gather the broken pieces, my hands trembling slightly as apple slices stuck to my fingers. For a moment I just stared at them, the dessert I'd made with such care, now nothing but a mess on a floor too clean for warmth. And yet, in the middle of the humiliation, something inside me went still. I realized that this public cruelty, was the last mask falling away. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The truth was standing right there, for everyone to see. I stood up slowly, brushing crumbs from my hands. Across the yard, Ethan looked at me through tears. I gave him a small smile, soft and steady, to tell him that I was all right, even when I wasn't. Because sometimes, dignity isn't about how much you endure. It's about knowing when you've seen enough. I stood still. The world around me blurred, the laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, all fading into a distant hum, as if I were underwater. The music that had filled the garden moments ago now sounded hollow, far away. I could only hear the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat, slow and deliberate, like a quiet drum marking the end of something I could never return to. The shattered pie still lay behind me, the scent of cinnamon and apples now heavy, almost sour in the warm air. For a moment I stared at the bright decorations fluttering in the wind, the ribbons, the balloons, the glossy smiles that pretended nothing had happened. And then, deep within me, a voice rose, calm and clear, like someone I used to be whispering from a long time ago. That's enough, Linda. Remember this moment, because from here, everything will change. It wasn't anger that filled me, nor sadness. It was something colder, steadier, clarity, the kind that only comes when the illusion finally shatters. I realized I had spent too many years trying to be gentle with people who mistook kindness for weakness. Too many years forgiving what should have been confronted. I turned toward the gate, each step careful, measured. The gravel crunched softly beneath my shoes. Behind me, the laughter resumed, cautious at first, then louder, trying to cover the awkward silence I left behind. But it didn't matter. Their noise no longer reached me. The sunlight was bright outside the fence, almost blinding after the shade of the party. I paused once, glanced back, not at them, but at the two small figures near the swing set. Ethan and Liam were still there, watching me silently. Ethan raised a hand, a tiny, uncertain wave. I smiled at him, gentle, reassuring, and hoped he'd understand that love doesn't end when you walk away. Sometimes it begins there. When I stepped through the gate, the wind shifted, carrying away the last echoes of that house. I didn't rush. I simply walked, the basket still in my hand, lighter now that it held nothing. My reflection glimmered faintly in the car window. An older woman, calm, composed, no longer invisible. For the first time in years, I wasn't the quiet mother waiting for respect. I was the woman who had finally chosen herself. And as I closed the car door, I whispered again, softly this time, like a vow. Everything changes today. That night, the house was silent except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it listens. I moved slowly through the dark hallway, Daisy padding quietly behind me, until I reached the small corner where Harold's picture hung above the mantel. The candlelight flickered as I struck a match, the flame trembling for a moment before finding its steady glow. I placed the candle in front of his photo. His smile, warm, patient, unchanging, looked back at me as if waiting for an explanation. My fingers brushed against the frame. "You'd laugh at me, wouldn't you?" I whispered. All these years I thought patience was strength. On the table lay the folder I had brought out earlier, the loan document, notarized and signed in Johnson's own handwriting. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the black ink of his name was sharp, undeniable. Johnson Hale. The same hand that once drew me childish birthday cards, now tied to a debt born of greed and betrayal. I unfolded the paper carefully, tracing his signature with my fingertip, the way I used to smooth his hair when he was small. $200,000, I murmured. And still, I would have forgiven him if he had just said sorry. The candlelight danced across the ink, turning it gold and alive. In that trembling glow, I felt the years of silence, humiliation, and loneliness gathering into something sharper: purpose. I reached for my notebook, the one filled with records, hospital dates, receipts, and copies of every conversation and transaction since the day of that accident. Each line, each timestamp, a thread in the web I had been quietly weaving. The evidence wasn't just legal, it was moral, and it was complete. For months, I had let them believe I was old, fragile, harmless. I had smiled, nodded, kept quiet. But tonight, as the candle burned lower, I felt that quiet turn into armor. I looked back at Harold's photo. "I tried to keep this family together," I said softly, my voice steady now. "But they mistook kindness for weakness. So from now on, I'll let justice speak for me." I folded the loan paper and slipped it into a brown envelope, along with a neatly typed letter to my attorney. Short, factual, and final. The first domino was ready to fall. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but I didn't feel cold. The candle flame wavered once more before standing tall again, as if in agreement. I took a deep breath, extinguished it gently with my fingertips, and whispered into the fading glow, "Good night, Harold. Tomorrow, everything begins." The next morning the air was crisp, cold enough that I could see my breath as I walked up the stone steps of the law office. The brass plaque beside the door still read, "Caldwell and Associates," the same firm that had helped Harold and me settle the house years ago. I hadn't been back since his passing. For a brief moment I stood outside, collecting myself. Then I straightened my coat, tucked the folder of documents under my arm, and pushed the door open. The receptionist recognized me instantly. "Mrs. Hale," she said kindly. "It's been a long time." I gave her a small nod. "Yes," I replied, "too long." A few minutes later, I was led into Mr. Caldwell's office. The room hadn't changed. Polished oak furniture, books lined neatly across the walls, the faint smell of leather and paper. He rose from behind his desk, offering a warm handshake. "Linda," he said, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. How are you holding up?" I sat down, setting the folder carefully on the desk between us. "I've been better," I said quietly, then met his eyes with a calm firmness. "But I'm ready to make some changes." He adjusted his glasses. "Changes?" "Yes." I opened the folder, sliding out the notarized loan agreement, a copy of my old will, and a list of my current accounts. The papers made a soft rustle, the sound of something decisive. "I want to revise my entire will." Mr. Caldwell blinked, surprised. "All of it?" "All of it," I said, my tone steady but unyielding. "Every line, every name. I want it rewritten from the ground up." He studied me for a long moment, as if trying to read what had brought me here. "Does this have to do with your son?" he asked gently. I didn't answer right away. My gaze drifted toward the window, where sunlight spilled across the desk in sharp golden lines. "Let's just say," I finally said, "I've learned that love without respect has no place in my legacy." He nodded slowly, his expression softening into quiet understanding. "Then let's get started," he said, reaching for his pen. As I began outlining each change, calmly, precisely, I felt a strange sense of stillness settle over me. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation, the act of taking back what had always been mine: my choices, my dignity, my peace. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that in a quiet law office, an old woman had just redrawn the boundaries of her life. I sat across from Mr. Caldwell as the late morning light filtered through the blinds, slicing the room into quiet bands of gold and shadow. The sound of his pen scratching against paper was steady, deliberate. Each word he wrote was another brick in the wall I was finally building, one that would protect what truly mattered. "I'd like to establish a trust," I said clearly, "for my two grandsons, Ethan and Liam." He nodded, pausing to adjust his glasses. "And the terms?" "The trust will remain locked until they each turn 21. No withdrawals, no interference from their parents. Not a cent touched until they're old enough to understand what integrity means." He smiled faintly. the kind of look that carried both respect and a quiet ache. A wise choice. I handed him the second document, my handwriting neat and unwavering. As for the remainder, I continued, I want it transferred to the Foundation for the Protection of Abused and Elderly Women. Caldwell looked up surprised. All of it? All that's left, I confirmed. I've had enough of watching women like me being dismissed, patronized, or left behind. Maybe this way, something good can come from what's been broken. He wrote it down without another question, his pen gliding across the page. The air felt lighter somehow, as if every sentence lifted a little more of the weight I had carried for years. When we reached the section naming beneficiaries, he hesitated. "And your son, Mrs. Hale?" I folded my hands in my lap. "Remove him. Remove her," I said quietly. "Their names no longer belong in anything I leave behind." He didn't argue, he simply nodded, waiting for the next instruction. "But," I added, "include one clause, clearly stated. They are required to repay the $200,000 loan within 6 months. No extensions, no excuses. If they fail to do so, the matter goes directly to court." Caldwell's pen paused for a heartbeat, then moved again, each word crisp and deliberate. When he finished, he pushed the papers toward me. "Would you like to read it over?" I scanned the pages slowly, line by line. The trust for the boys, the foundation donation, the repayment clause. My eyes lingered on the empty space where my son's name used to be. Oddly enough, I didn't feel sadness, only clarity. "I'll sign it," I said finally. My voice didn't shake. As I put my pen to paper, the ink flowed smooth and dark, like the closing of one story and the quiet beginning of another dot. Mr. Caldwell studied me for a long moment after I signed the last page. His pen rested on the desk, his gaze thoughtful, steady. The light from the window caught the silver strands in his hair, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low but certain. "You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Hale," he said. "They'll have to learn a lesson that money can't buy." For a moment, the words hung in the quiet air of his office. I looked down at the papers spread before me, the trust documents, the signed revisions, the clause about repayment, and felt something shift inside. Not triumph, not even relief, just peace. I met his eyes and said softly, "This isn't revenge. It's just to remind them where the line is." He nodded, almost smiling. "Boundaries," he said. "The hardest thing to teach, especially to family." I leaned back slightly, exhaling a long, steady breath. Outside, the city buzzed faintly beyond the glass, a hum of life that went on, indifferent and endless. Inside, the stillness felt heavier but cleaner somehow, like the air after a storm. For years I had confused silence with peace. Now I understood the difference. Silence was what others imposed on you. Peace was what you took back for yourself. Mr. Caldwell gathered the documents carefully, sliding them into a leather folder. "I'll file everything today," he said. "You'll receive the finalized copies next week." "Thank you," I replied. My voice was calm, almost detached, but underneath was a quiet steadiness I hadn't felt in years. As I stood to leave, he said gently, "You know, not everyone has the courage to draw that line." I gave a faint smile. "I suppose age helps," I said. "When you've lived long enough, you stop fearing the storm. You start learning how to sail through it." He chuckled softly, then opened the door for me. The hallway outside smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper. I walked out, folder in hand, the sound of my heels echoing against the polished floor, a rhythm that no longer felt hesitant. By the time I stepped back into the sunlight, the wind had shifted. The sky was a soft, forgiving blue. I stood there for a while, feeling the warmth on my face. Somewhere behind me, a younger woman was laughing into her phone, her voice bright and careless. For the first time, I didn't envy that ease. I had earned a different kind of freedom, the one that comes when you stop asking to be understood. As I walked down the street, the folder pressed to my chest, I whispered quietly to myself, "Not revenge, just balance." And for the first time in a long time, the words felt like truth. And just as I had felt deep down, justice began to move faster than I could have imagined. It started quietly, almost accidentally. 2 days after the disastrous birthday party, I was sitting by the window with Daisy asleep at my feet when my phone began to vibrate non-stop. At first, I ignored it. Then Alice called, her voice breathless, half shocked, half thrilled. "Linda," she said, "have you seen it? Someone filmed what happened at the party. It's everywhere." I frowned, unsure what she meant. But when she sent me the link, my hands froze before the screen. The thumbnail alone was enough to make my heart lurch. Susan's hand mid-air, the pie flying from my grasp, Ethan crying out, "Mom, Grandma made that for me." The video title blazed across the screen like a headline of poetic justice. "Rich daughter-in-law throws mother-in-law's birthday cake on the ground." By that afternoon, it had already gone viral. Thousands of comments poured in beneath the clip. How could anyone humiliate an old woman like that? Those poor kids. Money doesn't buy class. The video spread across every platform: Facebook, Reddit, local news pages, even morning talk shows. The neighborhood that once whispered behind my back now whispered about Susan instead. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The world had simply turned on its own axis, and for once the truth didn't need my voice to be heard. Within days, things began to unravel for them. Johnson's company, already under investigation, faced renewed scrutiny after the viral storm. Clients withdrew, fearing association with scandal. Susan's image as the elegant socialite of Cleveland Heights shattered overnight. The charity board she chaired released a statement distancing the organization from recent personal controversies. Alice told me that reporters had even come by the neighborhood, asking questions. I declined every interview. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted silence, the kind that comes after a storm when you know the wind is no longer blowing against you. Still, late that night, I watched the video once more. The moment she struck the basket, the pie falling, Ethan crying, it all played back like a film I no longer starred in. Only this time, I felt nothing but clarity. This was never about revenge. It was simply life turning the mirror back toward those who refused to see themselves. As I blew out the candle beside Harold's picture that night, I whispered, "Justice doesn't always need a lawyer, does it?" The video spread through every corner of the local internet like wildfire. By the next morning, it wasn't just neighbors talking, it was the entire town. News pages, parenting forums, community groups, every feed I opened seemed to echo the same outrage. The clip had been shared thousands of times, stitched into commentary videos, even turned into slow-motion edits that replayed the moment the pie hit the ground again and again. Underneath, the comments poured in, fierce and raw. A mother who worked her whole life raising her son alone, and this is how she's treated? Those hands built a family. Shame on the people who mocked them. Money can't wash away cruelty. One comment in particular stopped me cold. It read, "A woman who once scrubbed hospital floors so her child could have an education, humiliated in front of strangers because of those same calloused hands." I stared at that line for a long time. It wasn't written about someone famous, some headline on national news. It was about me. A woman who had once believed her work made her invisible, now seen by thousands who didn't even know her name. I didn't post anything. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. The truth had already taken on a life of its own, carried by voices stronger and louder than mine. For years I had been spoken over, dismissed, or politely ignored. But now, strangers were speaking for me, and somehow that felt like justice in its purest form. Alice called again that afternoon, her tone a mix of awe and satisfaction. "Linda, you're trending on the neighborhood forum," she said, almost laughing. "People are furious. Some are even calling for Susan to apologize publicly." I smiled faintly, shaking my head. "Let them talk," I said softly. "It's not about revenge anymore." When evening came, I sat by the window with Daisy curled at my side, scrolling through the messages one last time. Between the outrage and sympathy, there were small bursts of warmth, people sharing their own stories of being looked down on, of being told they weren't good enough. One woman wrote, "My daughter stopped by my house today and hugged me after watching that video. She said, 'Mom, you've worked so hard. I love your hands.'" I closed my phone, eyes stinging, and whispered to the quiet room, "Maybe that's what this was for." Outside, the town lights flickered on one by one, like candles lighting the truth dot. Within 2 weeks, the storm that started from a single video had turned into a hurricane. Susan's name, once whispered with admiration in Cleveland Heights, became a cautionary tale. Her company's email inbox flooded, not with new clients but with cancellation notices. One after another, longtime partners withdrew their contracts. A luxury furniture brand ended its sponsorship, citing ethical concerns. A real estate developer publicly stated, "We cannot continue to associate with individuals who lack integrity." By the third week, the whispers had turned into headlines. The local paper ran the story. Financial firm under investigation for questionable investments. And below that, a familiar photo, Susan and Johnson at a gala, smiling for the cameras. The investigation moved fast. Authorities began reviewing company accounts, tracing funds, uncovering inconsistencies that had been ignored for years. The lavish lifestyle they flaunted, designer handbags, imported cars, charity galas, suddenly looked less like success and more like evidence. Johnson tried to control the damage. He called old clients, begged for patience, blamed mismanagement and bad timing. But the truth was, people no longer wanted to listen. Once reputation cracks, money can't glue it back together. Susan, meanwhile, was fighting her own battles. The Women's Foundation she once chaired voted to suspend her indefinitely. Social invitations disappeared overnight. Those who used to flatter her now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Even her so-called friends in the investment circle deleted photos with her from social media. The irony was sharp. The woman who had mocked my old hands for being too rough now had to use her own to clean the mess she made. As for Johnson, he spiraled quietly. His once confident stride turned hesitant. Rumors spread that their mansion had been mortgaged, that the bank had frozen his accounts. He had spent years running from his roots, ashamed of the mother who once scrubbed hospital floors. Now he was back where he started, but without dignity. People in the neighborhood began to talk, but not with pity. There was a strange kind of justice in their downfall, swift, public, undeniable. They had climbed too high on borrowed pride, and when the truth came, it tore through their false elegance like a blade through silk. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. I simply sat by the window that night, the news on mute, Daisy sleeping by my side. The screen showed their faces, pale, tired, cornered, and I whispered, "From the top of the world to the bottom of their own making." One quiet afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the maple trees, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't hurried or loud, just 3 slow, uncertain taps, like someone testing if they still had the right to be there. Daisy barked once, then fell silent, her ears perked. I set down my cup of tea and walked to the door, my heart calm but curious. When I opened it, I saw a man I barely recognized. Johnson stood there, shoulders slumped, his once tailored suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow and red-rimmed. The confident, polished son I remembered was gone. In his place stood a man stripped of pretense, just flesh, fatigue, and guilt. "Mom," he said softly, his voice cracking, "I'm sorry, I just want you to forgive me." For a long moment I said nothing. The breeze carried the faint scent of fallen leaves into the hallway. I studied him, not with anger, not with pity, but with the clarity that only time and betrayal can bring. "Forgiveness," I finally said, my tone calm, almost gentle, "isn't a word, Johnson. It's an action, and for years you've done nothing but push me away." He lowered his gaze, his lips trembling. "I know, I was wrong. I thought I was protecting my family. I didn't realize how cruel I'd been." I took a small step forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "You once told me not to meddle in your life. You said I embarrassed you, that having a mother like me made you lose face." He closed his eyes, shame flickering across his features. I continued quietly, "Well, I listened. I stayed away. I let you live the life you wanted, surrounded by the people you chose, and look where it brought you." For a moment, he looked as though he might fall apart right there on the porch. The silence between us was thick, but not cruel. It was heavy with truth. "I'm not here to punish you," I added softly. "But forgiveness doesn't erase the past, Johnson. It only means I've stopped letting it hurt me." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "Can I come in?" he asked, almost like a child. I looked at him for a long time, then gently shook my head. Not today, I said. Some doors take time to open again. And then, quietly, I closed the door. Not out of hatred, but peace. I handed him the letter slowly, the paper folded neatly, the ink still fresh. Johnson hesitated before taking it, his fingers trembling slightly as if the thin envelope weighed 100 pounds. I could see in his eyes that he already knew what it was, a formal demand for repayment. No anger, no accusations, just facts, written in black and white. "Mom," he whispered, his voice rough, "you don't have to do this." I looked at him calmly, my hands clasped in front of me. "Yes, I do," I said softly. "This isn't about anger. It's about balance. You borrowed money, Johnson. Not from a stranger, but from someone who trusted you. And trust has a price when it's broken." He stared down at the letter, unable to meet my gaze. The silence between us stretched thin, like glass about to crack. "I'm not here to humiliate you," I continued, my tone gentle but firm. "But love isn't supposed to mean closing your eyes to betrayal. I spent my life giving, time, care, forgiveness. Now I'm learning that even love needs boundaries." He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "I just wanted to make things right," he said. I nodded. "Then start here. Do what's right. The letter isn't punishment. It's a reminder that respect is the only way back." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves across the porch. Daisy whined softly at my feet, sensing the tension. Johnson shifted, the weight of shame pressing down on him like gravity itself. "I never thought you'd do this," he muttered. I smiled faintly. Neither did I. But life has a way of teaching us lessons we should have learned earlier. He looked up finally, eyes wet. "Do you still love me?" The question lingered in the air, fragile and trembling. I took a breath before answering. "Always," I said. "But love doesn't mean letting someone hurt you twice. This letter, it's not the end. It's just where I stop bleeding." For a moment he stood there, silent, the letter clenched in his hand. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, his figure shrinking down the path until it disappeared behind the trees. Inside, I closed the door quietly. The house was still again. I sat at the table, looking at the faint sunlight spilling across the floorboards, and whispered to myself, "Boundaries are not cruelty. Their protection. Now, comma, every morning feels softer than the last. The air carries a quiet kind of peace, the kind that doesn't demand attention, only presence." I wake early, make my tea, and step outside to tend to the garden. The soil is cool between my fingers as I plant another row of asters, those humble violet-blue flowers that Susan once called cheap. I used to let her words sting. Now I find comfort in their simplicity. They bloom without asking for approval, and maybe that's what I've learned to do too. The wooden fence at the edge of the yard creaks faintly, the way old things do when they still have purpose. And right on cue, I hear it. The laughter of two familiar voices. Ethan and Liam come pedaling down the path, their bicycles rattling over the gravel, the morning light glinting on their helmets. They stop in front of the gate, breathless, cheeks flushed. "Grandma!" they shout together. Liam holds out a small bottle of milk. Ethan carries a bag with shiny red apples. They climb off their bikes and run to me, arms wide, hugging me so tightly as if I might vanish if they let go. I hold them close, breathing in the scent of sunlight and innocence, their warmth grounding me in a way no fortune or apology ever could. "Grandma," Ethan says after a while, looking up at me with those honest eyes, "are you still sad?" I smile, brushing the dirt from my gloves. "No, sweetheart," I say gently. "I'm not sad anymore, just sorry." "Sorry for what?" Liam asks, frowning. "For the people who grow old," I answer, "but never learn how to be human. They don't fully understand, but they nod as if they do, the way children do when they sense something deeper than words." Ethan picks one of the asters and tucks it behind my ear, laughing. "You look pretty, Grandma," he says. I laugh too, that easy, quiet kind of laughter that comes from peace, not joy. As the boys chase Daisy around the yard, I sit down on the porch steps, watching the sunlight spill over everything, the flowers, the fence, the laughter. The world feels lighter now, not because justice was served, but because truth finally found its place. Sometimes I think of Harold. I imagine he'd be proud, not of the revenge, but of the calm that followed it, of the woman who learned that survival can look like silence, and that dignity can bloom even in the soil of heartbreak. And as the wind stirs the asters around me, I whisper to the quiet morning, peace doesn't come after the storm, it grows from it. Inside the house, the late sunlight spilled gently through the window, painting everything in gold. The air was still, filled with that quiet glow that only comes at the end of the day, when the world seems to pause, just for a heartbeat. The light fell across the mantel, touching the framed photo of my husband. His familiar smile seemed softer in that golden hue, as if time itself had forgiven everything that once hurt. I walked closer, my steps slow against the wooden floor. The house no longer felt empty, it breathed again, in rhythm with my calm. I placed a hand on the photo frame, tracing the edge with my fingertips. Everything, I whispered, my voice barely above a breath, has finally come back to where it belongs. Outside, the wind rustled through the asters, carrying with it the laughter of my grandchildren. Their voices were faint but full of life, like music drifting through the open window. I closed my eyes for a moment and let it sink in. The sound of peace, the sound of endings that weren't bitter but necessary. Justice, I realized, was never about punishment. It didn't need shouting, revenge, or spectacle. True justice was quiet. It arrived without an announcement, without applause. It was the stillness that follows a storm, when what's broken finally settles into truth. For so long I had been the woman others underestimated, the quiet one, the forgiving one, the one who swallowed every insult in the name of family. But tonight, as the last ray of sunlight touched Harold's face in the frame, I saw something different in my reflection on the glass: strength, clarity, freedom. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the calm breath of a woman who refused to disappear. I sat down by the window, the candle flickering beside me, and looked out at the fading sky. The world outside was unchanged, yet everything inside me had shifted. The weight was gone. The silence was no longer empty. It was sacred. To anyone listening, anyone who's ever been silenced, doubted, or made to feel small, I want to say this: tell your story. Don't wait for permission. The moment you speak your truth, you reclaim what was taken. And in that moment, you'll understand that peace isn't something given. It's something earned, quietly, bravely, and entirely your own.